choose all substance, what remains the mystical sectarian gains.
Okay, so it is April 16, 2014, and it's the 16th day of the first Hebrew month as well. So we're going to start off with prayer. And yes, Lorna just pointing out before we pray that this was the day of the month in 31 AD that Christ was crucified, put on the cross at the third hour, and died at the ninth. And so it was a Friday that year, and he'd be resting on the Sabbath. So let's pray, and then we will get into what we're going to be discussing tonight. Thank you, Heavenly Family, for everything that you've done. Thank you for sending your Son. And thank you, brother, for being so willing to come and to suffer even to the point of death on our behalf. And not any ordinary death at that, and not even a martyr's death. But you took our sins upon you, even becoming sin for us, and dying, abolishing the enmity, the carnal mind, to save us from ourselves, and to give us yourself and your life to be our life. We thank you for opening our graves and giving us an opportunity to receive your life and to come forth and to be more than conquerors. Thank you, Heavenly Family. Thank you so much. I want to ask, Sister, that as we go through the message that you have given us for tonight, that you give me the right words and the ability to explain these things clearly and in such a way that your love will be manifested and will be understood and experienced more than ever before. So help us all to understand and help us all to learn, and give us that spirit of unity, true unity in you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Father, Mother, for sending your Son and daughter, the branch he and she. Amen. All right. So we started off, of course, on Passover discussing the eating of the flesh of the Son of God and the drinking of his blood, and how that message is the message of justification by faith. And in continuing this, we saw last Tabernacles that is the message which we bear. And we won't go all into the details of that now, but the message of present truth is the message of the gospel, of justification by faith. And we understand that this message did not just spring up out of nowhere, but it has a history behind it and it has a foundation. And we've been looking at one of these foundation stones since yesterday morning. And what we have been going through is what is the spirit of prophecy. And in doing this, we started with the scriptures, and we went through the New Testament and the Old Testament, and we went through types and examples, and we went through and saw patterns in the scriptures, and saw what the spirit of prophecy itself is. So I know I've asked it a few times, but again, what is the spirit of prophecy? What's the spirit of prophecy? The testimony
of
Yeshua
Jesus Christ,
that's right, of Jesus, of Yeshua, by
the Holy Ghost,
by the Holy Spirit,
and through
the living prophet.
Right. So we have the Spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus by the Holy Spirit through a living prophet. And this has been going from Eden, and it's to go till when? Right. Till we're face to face, till Jesus comes, right? And God has sent us prophets in His what?
Compassion.
In His compassion, according to Jeremiah. And this is the love of parents for their children, right? This is why prophets were sent. And so we've gone through and we've seen this foundation going back to Eden and progressing all the way through up until at least a certain point. And we're going to be continuing on from that point. We saw yesterday, we went through the New Testament, but then we saw that there was a great falling away, and that then, after this period of the Dark Ages, that the spirit of prophecy was again manifest through a young woman who later became known as Ellen White. But that she died as well in 1915. But when she was alive, her and the pioneers of the Advent movement understood what the spirit of prophecy is. And we went through a lot of statements, and we have the book, What is the Spirit of Prophecy? This is the SDA edition with comments from James White, Ellen White, A.D. Jones, and others. And when Ellen White died, we saw that very quickly after that, there was a shift in the doctrine from understanding that the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus through or by the Holy Spirit and through the prophets, to the spirit of prophecy being the volumes of the writings of Ellen White. And we also saw that following that point, the spirit of prophecy would have to again be re-manifested. And we believe that that was re-manifested through Victor Hodeff, bringing the message of the shepherd's rod. And we went through and we saw that he teaches the same thing on this subject. That's what we went through earlier today. And that was the first section of the book that we're still in, called The End of Davidian Quiescence. We went through the first section, which is called What is the Living Spirit of Prophecy? And we saw that Hodeff, for added clarity, used the term living spirit of prophecy, or active spirit of prophecy, or even ever-living spirit of prophecy, active in their midst, he says one time, to really emphasize that, hey, the spirit of prophecy is not just something that came out of the blue when Ellen White started to write, and that ended when she died. The spirit of prophecy has been with us since the gates of Eden, and continues all the way to the second coming. So there's a need of continued inspiration. And we talked a little bit about how each of these messages, which have come throughout time, build upon one another. So we want to understand that a little bit better, but I'll just quickly recap that. And then we want to get into this subject of the shepherd's rod, the last. And what that is that today, the common thought among Davidians, among those who believe or proclaim to believe the shepherd's rod message, is that that message is the last, that there is no more to follow, and that Victor Hodeff was the last prophet, and that there are no more to follow him. And so this is something that I personally believed at one point, that it was the last and there was no more to follow, and that others here personally believed, and that we perhaps believed even very strongly. But we had to change our position. And that is because of the things that we've been reading, and because of the truth of continual revelation. So just a recap, I want to cite you all to a study that Victor Hodeff gave on the calls of Matthew 20. And it just kind of gives a summary of some of the main revelations of new truth. And it's a parable. It gives these 5 calls, and there are these revelations that are distinct one from another, and they come at these different hours. We won't go into the details. But the different movements were inclusive of the Exodus movement and the movement in the time of Christ and the Millerite movement and the Adventist movement, and then this 11th hour movement. And something that they all had in common is they all had to do with the sanctuary service. We talked about how outside of the gates of Eden, the sacrificial law was instituted. But that wasn't the end of the light on salvation, because the sacrificial law was the gospel, or salvation, in types and symbols. What we saw is that when it got to the time of Moses, and they needed to be reminded of all these truths that they had forgotten, it was given to them to have a tabernacle, an earthly sanctuary, whether traveling or later a stationary temple. And through these services of the temple and the temple itself, they were supposed to learn the system of salvation. But what did they do? They turned it into a mere round of ceremonies. Dead formalism is what it was. Not by creation, not by how it was given to them, but what they turned it into by not allowing the converting influence of these things in the law and the converting influences of the continual wisdom given to them through the messages of the prophets. They turned all of it into a dead formalism by not allowing it to work its converting influence upon their hearts. Then in the time of Christ, there was again a revelation given, and it had to do with, again, that ceremonial law. It had to do with the system of salvation, this time not just in type, but what the type was pointing forward to. How we had this high priest, but now we have a real high priest whose priesthood endures forever. And that, of course, is Christ. And he went to be our priest in a temple, but not the temple of the earthly sanctuary. He went to be the high priest in the heavenly sanctuary, the temple or the tabernacle not made with hands. And so again, the sanctuary was being revealed, and the system of salvation was brought clearly to the minds of those who would receive it. And of course, Paul, interpreting by inspiration the prophecies of Daniel, informed those who were listening to him that there would be a falling away. And it happened. And we're still seeing this falling away and these dark ages going on today, or at least the results of it, if you just want to look at it as a historical dark ages. Coming to the end of that, there was another message about the sanctuary, about the system of salvation. And that was that the sanctuary would be cleansed. And of course, there was a misunderstanding of what that meant, because the light that they received, they being the Millerites, during the time of the first and second angel's message, the light that they received was not all the light to be given. But they had a unique message, and they learned some of these marvelous truths. And then after 1844, Ellen White was called to bear a message, as we've spoken of, and she saw in vision the sanctuary, and she saw the Ark of the Testament, and she saw the Ten Commandments, and she saw the Sabbath with the halo about it, and she saw Christ mediating on our behalf. This time, not only in the work of the holy place, in his daily intercession, but moving into the most holy place to perform and to go through the investigative judgment first upon the dead. And then Ellen White, after faithfully bearing that message for many years, passed away in 1915. But is that all Christ was to do in the sanctuary? Or was Christ to do more? Was there to be more truth? Was there to be more activity in the sanctuary above? The Adventists from the beginning knew that Christ has been given, into his hands have been given all judgment, and that he is to judge both the quick and the dead, which means the living and the dead. And they understood from Daniel's prophecies and from the prophecies of Revelation that the judgment first starts with reviewing the cases of those who have died, going back from the beginning all the way up till 1844. And that at some point, the judgment would pass from the cases of the dead to the living. But Ellen White, in her lifetime, all the way till she died, never announced that the judgment for the living was at hand. So, if Christ ever was to judge the living, surely the Lord will do nothing save to reveal His secrets to His servants, the prophets. So there is to be another message, just in line with everything that we've seen, that there must be continual revelation, and the spirit of prophecy is ever living. It shall continue on. So, in 1929, Victor Hodeff, he was starting to receive light on Isaiah's prophecies. And Isaiah's prophecies dealt with the judgment affecting those on earth, not just restricted to the cases of those who had already passed in the judgment for the dead, but that the Lord was also to judge the living. And so he announced that it was soon to begin this judgment upon the living. And as his message progressed, there was more and more and more light revealed. Light which would tell us what would take place when the judgment for the living would commence. And tomorrow we'll be looking at more of the specifics of the purpose of Hodeff's message and what kind of the core of it was about and what it was pointing forward to. And so the basic thing, though, is that it was about the announcement of the judgment for the living, which brings in the purification of the church and finally results in the establishment of God's kingdom. And along with this, he pointed forward to a number of things that were supposed to happen in this purification, which included, and again, like I said, we'll get to these statements tomorrow, this included a new message. It included the revelation of Christ's new name. It included the restoration of the ancient statutes in antitype. These are all things that Hodeff, through inspiration and through interpretation, prophesied would take place at the commencement of the judgment for the living. So, every message has come relying upon or building upon the messages prior to it, but pointing to something ahead. You know, Ellen White said that there would be another angel coming to join the third angel. She said that judgment must begin upon the living, though we do not know when. And so there was a message that came. And Ellen White's message was clearly based off of what was already there in the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. So when Hodeff came, he likewise had a message which had its foundation on the prior truths of the previous messages, but also pointed forward to something to take place. And that was the new message which he said would come in at the commencement of the judgment for the living. So that's our focus probably tomorrow morning, and, well, I guess all the studies tomorrow. But what we want to do at this time is, since earlier today, we looked at a number of statements from the Shepherd's Rod message from the writings of Victor Hodeff, which clearly delineated the need for the spirit of prophecy in our midst to have not just the Bible and not just a human interpreter and not just the Spirit, but we must have the Spirit inspiring a living prophet to reveal the concealed prophecies of the Bible. And so we went through that in some detail earlier today, so we won't be recapping that too much. My personal experience with this is that the study that we went through earlier today, I, compiled these notes and I read it and I was like, wow, okay. The Rod teaches that there is a need for living prophets. I wasn't expecting that, but how do I reconcile that with all these other statements about Elijah being the last and the Rod message being the Elijah message and all these other statements which seem to imply that there was no more truth and no more prophets, that this was the last. And so, this article is the result of that, of me dealing with that conflict within myself, of how to deal with these apparently contradicting statements. And it was a big deal. I needed to know for sure, okay, is the rod just contradicting itself here? Or is it that I've missed something, that I've misunderstood something? So what we want to do as we look at these statements and at these principles is, again, just like we did last time, we don't want to take a set of statements and try to bend it to fit with another set of statements. And we'll just use this as an example. Let's say you could have a set of statements from the writings of Victor Hoff that say, there will be more prophets, there will be more truth. We need living prophets in our midst in order to have successful revival and reformation. Then you have another set of statements, and it says, the rod message is the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And Elijah brings that message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord is the last message. And Elijah is the last prophet. Well, that looks pretty in opposition one to another, right? So the tendency that we have is to say, okay, well, I know this one, I'm comfortable with this one, not too sure about those, so I'm going to look at those in such a way and interpret them in such a way as to kind of bend them over to this one, right? That's what we do when we try to harmonize these things, which is just what we naturally do. But when we do that, we miss the truth that this was saying. Or someone else might take these statements and try to bend them over to what this side is saying. What we want to do here is to look at these statements, which we already did this morning, to read them and to simply be honest with what they're saying, which we have done. And we've seen that the rod does indeed teach the need for living prophets. Now we want to look at these other statements. And this is just going to be an overview. We won't go through in detail. But what we want to do is see, what do these statements, in and of themselves, regardless of these ones, what do they really say? What is the rod message teaching when it talks about the last? And when we do, we will see that these two sets of statements are already in harmony. And there is no need for us to go and try to bend one set to the other, either way. And so at the end of that, that should leave us with okay, what it did for me was, at the end I was like, okay, I can honestly say that there's nothing in the rod saying that there's no more truth and no more prophets. And I can honestly say that the rod does teach that there will be more truth and there will be more prophets. So by the end of that, I was settled in my mind to say, okay, there's no question left. So we hope to go through this both for your guys' benefit and through everyone else's benefit who may be listening or watching this study later. And we want to encourage everyone here as well as everyone who watches this later to read the article. We have it online. We have hard copies that we can send you, because it just goes through in more detail than we will be able to. So, if you could scroll down here. The shepherd's rod, the last. And we have this question here. Does the shepherd's rod message teach that there is to be no more truth and no more prophets until the establishment of Christ's kingdom? So you can go down. We have a couple principles that we want to keep fresh in our minds. And if you could read them, that would be great.
Ever have your ears open to any claimant of inspiration if you are not to repeat the history of the Jews? God will not let you be deceived if you really hunger and thirst after righteousness, if you really want to know the truth. For He is anxious that you keep up with His progressively revealed truth. There is therefore no danger for one to be deceived by coming in contact with error, but there is a great danger for staying in darkness by not coming in contact with fresh truth. Timely Greetings, Volume 1, number 12, page 18.
And let me ask you, we went through this a little earlier, who were the sermons that ended up in the Timely Greetings preached to?
Davidians.
Davidians, right? He sent it abroad, but these were preached to Davidians. So, we are to ever have our ears open to any claimant of inspiration, unless we want to repeat that same history that they repeated in every generation. And we're told to thirst after righteousness, of course, which, to quench that thirst, we must come to Christ and believe on Him, eat His flesh and drink His blood. And we can see what the real danger is. You know, there's another place in the raw literature where Hodef talks about the fear of the Laodicean to come in contact with fresh truth and to be deceived. And he pointed out, well, according to the scriptures, you are already deceived. So why are you so afraid of deception? And he actually went through, this is in some of the old symbolic codes, he went through a list of reasons why they should not be afraid of deception. And it was, one of them was that you are already deceived according to the scriptures. So the worst that could happen is going from one deception to another, you know. But the real danger is being afraid to even investigate a claimant of inspiration, a claim for fresh truth. So Proverbs 18:13 says, "He that answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame unto him." So we want to ask everyone, regardless of previous positions or current positions or what the rod seems to be saying to them, we want to ask people to investigate this openly and to give a fair, candid hearing before firing against what we believe to be the truth. And we understand, and it's reasonable, that people may have an understanding of the truth, and they may be reading the rod message for all these years and think that it's saying something other than what we think it's saying. And they may just honestly, simply see it like that. But we want to ask everyone to be willing to reconsider and to understand that we ourselves held those same positions, but that we were caused to change them. And personally, I held that position very strongly. I was one of those, 100% rod-only believers, so to speak. And basically, I was kind of strict when it comes to that. But it's that strictness that led me to see that the real thing is broader than that. Because in my strictness to the rod message, I had to believe in what it says about the living spirit of prophecy. And that's what caused me to investigate further, which resulted in this study. So if you want to scroll down a little bit here, basically, we won't read all these. I encourage everyone to read them on their own time. But one thing I want to read is this. On the Shepherd's Rod folio-based CD, there are 750 hits when searching the term last. Contained within this study is a compilation of every one of those references. Below is an illustration of how the references are formatted in this article. And I want to let you guys know, too, that there are two versions of the Shepherd's Rod CD-ROM. One which contains the writings of the symbolic codes, and one which does not, except for the ones published after Victor Hodef died. The one that I was using contains the entire writings of Victor Hodef. And so I included every single occurrence of the word last in all of his writings. So I'll skip this part and just explain it to you when we see it. Okay, so what we have done here is that these sections, this part of this booklet, is put in sections where all these occurrences of the word last occur. And if you want to be real studious, you can go through every one of these sections and read them, which is what I had to do to put this together. And if someone really wants to know for sure and still has doubts for some reason, I encourage you to go through it all, because you can see, okay, this uses the word last in this way, and this uses the word last in this way. So we put it into categories of context. This first category is actually the largest, and we figured we'd get it out of the way right at the beginning. This is occurrences of the word last, which are not in reference to the shepherd's rod message or prophet. So, if you scroll down some more, and actually, once you get to the next page, you can pause for a second, because I want to briefly explain this. What we have is, here, this is Timely Greetings, Volume 1, number 14, page 12, paragraph 4. And this is page 21, paragraph 2. And, every time that there's a new publication or a new number, we put it in bold just to make it easy to follow. But then everything following that is within the same publication. So I just wanted to mention that, so it's just easy to follow. So you can scroll down more. And as you can see, there are quite a number of references. Okay, so here are some examples of how this word last was used in all the above references. Statements like at last, or at long last, or to last over a year, last Sabbath, last paragraph, last part, last seal. If time should last, last Wednesday, last days. Last days was a very frequent one. So those are references which, of course, aren't particularly relevant to this study. So the next is the last call, and it's in context of the last or the 11th hour call. So these are statements which refer to the rod message, or something which at least may refer to the rod message as being the 11th hour call, or having some sort of connection with the 11th hour call, or just by implication being the 11th hour call. For instance, some of these references say that the message of the judgment for the living is the 11th hour call. And elsewhere in the rod, we are told that the rod message is the message for the judgment for the living. Therefore, you can make the connection and say, okay, the rod is claiming, at least in one sense, to be the message of the 11th hour, the last call. So here are references that you can look at and see how Houteff talks about this. So you can scroll down a little bit more. Okay, let's go up a bit more again. Okay, we're going to read some of the comments here, and again, I encourage everyone to read a bit more. And if you could actually read here.
In examining the above quotations, one will find that the shepherd's rod claims to be the last call for laborers. To be in complete harmony with the rod, one needs to point out that the 11th hour call is said to have begun with the publication of Shepherd's Rod Volume 2, 2SR 9. But that later the message clearly identified the 11th hour call as being the loud cry to the world. 8 Tract, page 59 to 60.
And that's also, when I said title there, it's also the title to Tract 8, which is Mount Zion at the 11th hour.
And also 12 Tract, page 34. This presents no real problems when it is understood that the call itself is not given in a day, but is proclaimed continuously throughout a long period of time, beginning first to the church, then extending to the world. The fact that the rod message claims to be the 11th hour call, the last, in no way suggests that there are to be no more prophets or no more truths to be revealed. One way to understand this is to recognize that these calls were not 100% equivalent to messages. For instance, the 6th hour call is said to be the call given by the Millerites. Yet within that call, there was the first angel's message, the second angel's message, and the midnight cry. Likewise, the ninth hour call is said to be the Adventist message, which not only included all the messages preceding it, but also included the third angel's message and the message of righteousness by faith given in 1888. These simple facts show us in a simple way that even though the rod message is the 11th hour call, this does not in any way suggest that the call cannot include more truth or more prophets beyond those we knew of from 1929 to 1955.
So, we discussed this a little bit earlier, how there can be a message, and a message can have multiple phases, or there can be other messages connected with that message. So, of course, the message or the call of the Millerites also had with it the first angel's message, the second angel's message, and the midnight cry. The Advent message included all those and also had the third angel's message and the message of 1888. So notice that just the fact that it was the 6th hour call or the 9th hour call, none of those things removed the possibility of there being more light after that call was first sounded. In other words, the 6th hour call begun with the first angel's message. But just because it begun with that message did not mean that there could not be a second angel's message or midnight cry. And the 9th hour call begun with the message of the third angel, but that did not exclude the possibility of more light coming later, which did come in the message of 1888. So in other words, if the rod message in its beginning is the 11th hour call, and even if Hoddeth said nothing else other than that the rod is the 11th hour call, does that really make it impossible for there to be more messages, more truth, and more prophets coming following that is part of that 11th hour call, just like there was more messages and more truth part of the 9th hour call and part of the 6th hour call? You know, you can see that it's not really a reasonable conclusion to say that because of this, there can be nothing else. And also, especially since Hoddeth clearly states in Tract 1, he calls it the pre-11th hour extra. So there's something else about the 11th hour which was kind of future from when he wrote that. Then he called it Tract 8, Mount Zion at the 11th hour, and taught also that the 11th hour call is the loud cry to the world. So you can see he was himself understanding that the application of that call extended far beyond what he understood from 1929 to 1955. And he himself, as we'll see in later statements, said that what they published in the rod message was only the highlights, and they reserved the milk or the butter. So we can continue on to the next section, which is statements which refer to the last message due to being the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the message of the judgment for the living, the Elijah message. So all these statements here refer in some way, whether by implication or directly, or just that they have a possibility of meaning this. They refer to the rod message as being the last message because it's the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the Elijah message, the message of the judgment for the living. So, you can continue on reading actually with this paragraph on the screen.
The above quotations are very easy to understand when we consider them in the light of the facts. The message of the judgment for the living, we are told, is the last. Not only this, but we are told that the shepherd's rod message is the message of the judgment for the living. Here are some facts to consider. Dear fellow member, the only way for you to escape being taken by wolves in sheep's clothing is if you ever remember the fact that the judgment message, the last before Christ comes the second time, is what made us a people. That is, because the message had come, And because it has to be proclaimed, we SDAs came on the scene, and we certainly want to stay there until the work is finished. We must not become a back number as did the Protestant churches, since they rejected the messages one after another. God forbid that we should be spewed out and lose so late in the day. And what is the truth of the judgment? Jezreel letter number 2, page 1, paragraph 1.
So the Jezreel letters were letters sent to ministers and laity, mostly in 1953, coming close to the end of Victor Houghton's ministry. And what does he say here, if you actually scroll up again? He refers to something as being the last message, right? He says the judgment message, the last before Christ comes the second time. So that's really the last message, right? But what does he say? He said that that message, the last message, the judgment message, is what made us a people. He's writing here to who? Seventh-day Adventists, right? And he says that the last message is what made us a people. The message, because the message had come, and because it has to be proclaimed, we SDAs came on the scene. So he here is clearly saying that the last message is the message which formed the Adventist denomination, right? Well, then how could he bring a new message? You know, he proclaimed to have this new light and a new message, and that was the last. Wow, he really just tossed himself out, didn't he? You know? 110 years later. Yeah, you know, it's like, okay, all this time has passed, and that was the last message. But you know what? He's right. The judgment message is the last message. But how? Let's just say, within his own understanding, how could he justify his own message then? How could he even wrap his mind around that? Well, the next paragraph tells us. And you can scroll down to the next quote. It's Jezreel letter number 2, page 1, paragraph 2, right here. And the last question that he asked, just to keep it in mind, he says, "And what is the truth of the judgment?" So now he's answering his own question.
The judgment, as you know, is in 2 separate and distinct sections, one following the other. The judgment for the dead first, and the judgment for the living last. This we know is so, and we must not let subversive influences, even if they be in Seventh-day Adventists' garb, cause us to lose sight of this truth. Our part of the judgment message since 1844 has been, as you know, to proclaim the judgment for the dead, not for the living as yet. Jezreel letter number 2, page 1, paragraph 2.
So you can see there that he provides an answer to that. And what's the answer? That the judgment is in two parts. And that each of those respective parts has a message connected with it, right? The message of the judgment for the dead and the message of the judgment for the living. And all that together can be viewed as one message, the judgment message, the last. But you see, that message isn't just this one drop of water, this one indivisible drop, let's say. Water's not the best analogy for that. But it's not an indivisible thing. It comes in phases. The judgment for the dead and the judgment for the living. And so he clearly expected people, upon reading this, to know that there's a judgment for the dead and a judgment for the living. And if it's true that the Lord does not do anything except he reveals his secret to his servants, the prophets, then if he at some point is to begin the judgment for the living, he must let them know. And Houghton's message was the announcement of that judgment, as we shall see. And so we already went over some of the principles of the divisions of the message. But notice, we have this broad picture, the judgment message. This is the last. The first part of it is for the dead. And remember, in that part, you had the first angel's message, the second angel's message, midnight cry, the third angel's message, and the 1888 message. All of that was part of the message of the investigative judgment for the dead. You had all these different, that's 5 separate messages which within this judgment for the dead message, which is within the judgment message. And each of those can be broken down still further into individual messages that perhaps we would call sermons or teachings or whatever. You know, it can be divided into smaller and smaller bits. So what about the judgment for the living? If the judgment for the living is to repeat the judgment for the dead, which we are told, can we expect that it will just be this one block of a message? Or will it itself be divided into smaller subsections? So this is what we want to look at. Did Hodeff claim to have the message of the judgment for the living in all of its aspects until the end of time? Well, we'll see. You can scroll down to the next page. And there's a quote here that we have from White House Recruiter, page 37. And if you could read it.
When finally the judgment passes from the dead to the living, thus outmoding by expiration the initial phase of the first angel's message, the judgment of the dead, what timely truth will the church then have for herself and for the world? What indeed if she does not now accept and practice the message of very present truth, the final phase of the first angel's message, which is presently announcing the stealthy approach of judgment upon the living, and which is knocking at each heart's door?
So you can see there that Hodeff makes a particular claim for the message that he was sounding. And what was that claim? It is the final phase of the first angel's message, right? Announcing the stealthy approach. Does that mean that it had come already? No, it was stealthily approaching. Notice, stealthy approach. We want to keep that in mind for later. Stealthy approach of judgment upon the living. Notice that for the message of the judgment of the dead, the first angel's message first came by sounding the announcement, or by announcing the approach of the judgment upon the dead, not announcing that it had already come. And there was a misunderstanding even as to when it would begin. There had to be a correction in the time. We just want to keep these things in mind for later. So he's announcing here the first angel's message. But then notice that he also says, at the beginning, he said that he gives a reason as to how we will have truth when the judgment passes from the dead to the living. You see the purpose of this paragraph here? He's saying that in order to have the timely truth you will need when the judgment does pass from the dead to the living, which at that time they were stealthily approaching, in order to be ready for that truth, you had to accept the message, accept and practice the message of very present truth, the final phase of the first angel's message. In other words, he's saying, look, the time is coming soon when the judgment will pass from the dead to the living. And when it comes, there will be a new message which you will need, because the old message of the judgment for the dead will expire. It will no longer be present truth, because we would no longer be in the judgment for the dead. And you need to be ready to accept this new truth when it comes. And how will you be ready to accept it? Well, it's only by accepting and practicing the message that we have today, the first angel's message as it relates to the judgment for the living, which is announcing the stealthy approach of that judgment. Now, if the first angel's message is to repeat, is not the second angel's message and the third angel's message to repeat as it relates for the judgment for the living? Yes, right? These things are clearly borne out in the statements of Ellen White and Victor Hodeff. They both say that the first, second, and third angel's messages are to be repeated. So, again, that, to look at our little message box here, we have the judgment message. We have the judgment for the dead. We have the first angel's message, second angel's message, midnight cry, third angel's message, 1888. Then we have the judgment for the living, first angel's message, right? So it seems like there should be more there, right? There should be more. So that's what we need to be looking for here. You can read this next paragraph as well.
The message of the shepherd's rod here plainly declares itself to be the final phase of the first angel's message, which relates to the judgment of the living. If the first angel's message is to have a final phase in connection with the judgment upon the living, what of the other angel's messages?
And if you could read the next statement as well.
Among Adventists, the term third angel's message is understood to contain the first, second, and the third angel's messages, but not so when we use the expression second angel's message. The shepherd's rod is using the term third angel's message to convey the fact that the proclamation of all three angels' messages are to be repeated. The Symbolic Code, Volume 3, Number 8, page 9.
Quite clear. Go ahead.
Just going back to that previous statement,
Yes.
the paragraph before the quote.
Scroll up a little more. Yeah.
It's good. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, I thought you meant.
This paragraph right here.
Yeah, it's as if the first angel's message is to have a final phase in connection with the judgment upon the living. What of the other angels' messages? Now, but weren't we following the thread that he was still in the judgment of the dead period?
Yes.
So how did it get to be now a part of the judgment of the living message?
Right, and the reason for that, and that's a very good question, is how is it that Hoddef was sounding the judgment for the living message when he himself proclaimed to still be in the judgment for the dead? And the reason why is because just as with the judgment for the dead and the announcement of its coming, remember the first angel's message was first sounded by William Miller, starting from when? 1834? 1834, but when did the judgment begin? 1844. So the judgment for the dead message, as regarding the first angel, first begun with an announcement of that judgment beginning. But that announcement necessarily preceded the actual beginning of the judgment.
So the announcement is a part of the living message, but the actual thing is not come yet.
Right.
Okay.
So with Hoddef, the actual investigative judgment of the living had not yet begun, but he was given a message to announce its soon coming. And as it happened in the judgment for the dead, remember, go ahead.
Which makes sense because he's a prophet.
Yes.
He's a foreseer.
Right, he's a foreseer, that's right.
So what happened with the initial phase of these messages is that there was a first angel's message announcing it would come, and then there was a second angel's message, and shortly after the second angel's message begun, there was a midnight cry, which gave a correction of the time. And then the first angel's message again had a fuller application. The hour of his judgment is come. Following that, there was a third angel's message. And what we believe is that that same thing happened in regards to the messages for the judgment for the living. That Hoddef was announcing the judgment. And at first, just like William Miller thought it would take place at a certain time, but there needed to be a correction in the date. And we believe, and we'll see that in tomorrow's morning study, that Hoddef thought, but he even stated very clearly that it's not definite. Just like William Miller for years, he always had an if in his presentation. With Hoddef, he said that the judgment would begin in 1931, if, and he said this date is not definite. It may not begin here, but he thought it would be that time, but then there had to be another message that would come, which is the repetition of a second angel, and then immediately following that, a correction in the date. This time, not in the timing of when the judgment for the dead would begin, but in the timing of when the judgment for the living would begin. And we believe that these are the messages that have come, and that following that, there is again to be a third angel's message. So, without getting into all the details of that now, I wanted to give a brief explanation of that, and as we go on and look through the details of this, it will make more and more sense. So we'll continue on to the next message, or next section here. So these statements here are where the rod claims to be the last message in a general sense. By statements like, mercy is knocking at the door for the last time, or referring to the message as the last rescue effort. These are statements which are basically just not giving a particular reason for claiming to be the last. The previous, this is the last message because it's the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. These statements here don't give a particular reason, but it's saying that this is the last call, So let's look first at some statements from Ellen White to see if she said any similar sorts of things. The first one here is from Paulson Collection, page 67, paragraph 8. And if you'd like to just read these statements, that would be great.
I have been instructed that it is not extravagant display which is now required in giving the last message of mercy to our world.
Now notice here the tenses that she uses. Does she say when we will be giving this last message to the world? No, she says now required in giving the last message of mercy to our world. Continue on.
This is from Crest Collection, page 146, paragraph 2. The last message of mercy is being given to the world.
Present tense.
Crest Collection, page 35, paragraph 3. You are giving the last message of warning to our world. Ellen G. White, 1888 Materials, page 1148, paragraph 1. There are those who must be qualified for the work to be done now in bringing the last message of warning to all cities and in all towns in all parts of our world. And from Manuscript Release, volume 16, page 264, paragraph 2, we have the last message of warning, the last call of mercy.
So those are pretty clear statements, right? So, what if as a Davidian, you came up to an Adventist and you said, hey look, there's more light. I want to share with you this beautiful message which I've received. And they pull out these statements and they say, hey look, I've been warned. I know here, the spirit of prophecy tells me, I have the spirit of prophecy right here, and it tells me that this is the last message. How can you come and tell me that there's more? As Davidians, how would we explain that to Adventists? I want us to be thinking about that. But in the meantime, could you go through the next quotations?
From Review and Herald, January 19, 1905, paragraph 22. We have, as had John, a message to bear of the things which we have seen and heard. God is not giving us a new message.
Whoa, stop there. God is not giving us a new message. Wow, okay, well, automatically you Davidians are wrong. That's what someone might say, right? I mean, isn't that just so clear? Why even consider something more? Anyways, go ahead, continue on.
We are to proclaim the message that in 1843 and 1844 brought us out of the other churches. We need the Holy Spirit to kindle in our hearts the zeal and earnestness that were then seen among God's people. I thank the Lord that there are still living a few who can remember those days and who know whereof they speak. And this next one's taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, page 206, paragraph 3. The third angel of Revelation 14 is...
The third, not the fourth, not the fifth, the third. Go ahead.
is represented as flying swiftly through the midst of heaven, crying, "Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." Here is shown the nature of the work of the people of God. They have a message of so great importance that they are represented as flying in the presentation of it to the world. They are holding in their hands the bread of life for a famishing world. The love of Christ constraineth them. This is the last message. There are no more to follow, no more invitations of mercy to be given after this message shall have done its work. What a trust, what a responsibility is resting upon all to carry the words of gracious invitation. And the Spirit and the bride say, "Come," and let him that heareth say, "Come." And let him that is athirst come, and whosoever will, let him take the water of life freely.
So she says it right there, doesn't she? That third angel's message is the last, and that there are no more to follow, no more invitations, right? And so, we should just stop there, right? We should stop with the third angel's message, not be looking for more light and more messages of truth, because inspiration has told us that there's no more, right? It might be worth reading the next paragraph here. And this is my comment in writing this book.
Let all Davidians who think there is to be no more truth, no more messages, and no more prophets until the kingdom, carefully consider the above statements. How will you explain statements of this sort to Adventists who may ask? Will you not explain to them that, indeed, the message of the investigative judgment is the last, but there is more than one section to that message? After all, is that not how Hatef explained it? Besides, to say otherwise would contradict all that the above statements definitely say. The other extreme would be to take the above statements at surface value and say there are no more messengers or prophets to come after Ellen White. Is this not exactly what is being done by the majority of Davidians with their use of these, quote, last, end quote, statements by Victor Hatef? Please prayerfully consider.
In other words, in every generation, there is, to those who are confronted with a message of new truth, but who choose not to be responsive to it, there is a misuse of the writings of the previous prophets to try and cast down and destroy the present message. Now, I didn't quote it in this study, but if you read Ellen White's writings, does she not say clearly that there's much more light to be revealed and more messages of truth to be born to God's people, even messages that will be of a startling nature? You know, she states these things very clearly. And also, she even states in Revelation 14, once she comments on it, and she says, "We are now sounding the third angel and being prepared for the messages of the angels to follow." Plural messages, plural angels.
Where was that from?
I'll get it for you real quick. I'm pretty sure I have it written down right here beside Revelation 14. Yes?
When you say, I look at it this way, a message within a message unfolding.
Amen.
Because there are many things in the message that many do not understand, although you go to them and ask them, they don't understand it. So the message within a message is unfolding.
Amen.
That's all it is. It's unfolding.
It is quite simple once you understand it in that light, right? And Ellen White, the statements that we just read from her, they are actually instructive. They're letting us know that the message of the investigative judgment is the last message. And when she says we're to have no new message, it's very clear what she's referring to, because she refers back to 1843 and 1844, and we received these messages, the messages which called us out of the churches. And she says there's to be no new message. In other words, we're supposed to have the message of the judgment and of calling people out from confusion, right? So it's not that any message now that comes, or I'll phrase it like this. The reason why those statements are instructive is that every message that comes following that will be part of this judgment message. It's all part of the message, but these are messages within this broader judgment message. So this statement from Ellen White that I referred to is found in 1888 Materials. So Ellen G. White, 1888 Materials, page 1710.
1710?
Yes. And this is what she specifically says in this quote. We are announcing the message of the third angel and of the angels that follow the third. And then elsewhere, she, in one of the testimonies, she says that we have the third angel's message, and we are being prepared for the messages that follow. Messages, and she says, and the messenger that will follow. So, some of these statements, Davidians are used to. Not necessarily this one, the angels that follow, but are used to the statements where she's saying we're preparing for another message, because Davidians look at that and say, well, see, it's the rod message, but now this one's the last, right? Just like the Adventists do with the statements from Ellen White. Oh, no, this one's the last. You had something to say, or?
Oh, just all her statements that the first, second, and third will be repeated.
Oh, yeah.
So there's kind of like, there's that repeated in what way? There's something future.
Yes, they're to be repeated, and she also clearly teaches that there's much more truth to be connected with them in their repetition, with all her statements on new light and, so on and so forth, and how when the 1888 message came, they didn't understand what it was talking about, but yet she said it was the third angel's message in verity, and they had been sounding the third angel's message for all these years. So you think that they would have already understood it, but they didn't. So now there's the section following this is last call to the supper of Luke 14. And it's just a few statements that refer to that within the rod. And there's nothing particularly different about these statements which would cause for more comment other than what we've already gone through. And in light of what we have already looked at, these statements are easily understandable. So now the next is the last, or the seventh truth, implied by Ezekiel 4. Now, Ezekiel 4 is the vision of Ezekiel laying on his side for first 390 days and then 40 days. And throughout the 390 days, there were 6 grains representative of truth given. And the implication that Hoddeff points out is that, well, the Lord won't stop at 6. There has to be a 7th truth. And so there is the implication within the rod message, as found in these statements, that the message which the rod proclaims is that 7th truth. And so someone looking at that will, the implication may be, well, it's the 7th, and therefore it is the last. So it should be easy enough to understand in light of what we have seen so far. If you apply all the same principles to what we've already looked at, to this, it will be quite easy to understand. Even so, we do want to read some more statements. And if you scroll down a bit, actually scroll up a bit more. There was just the paragraph at the end of the page. And these 3 paragraphs are just a sample of places where the rod tells how it is not giving all the details. This statement is particularly in relation to Shepherd's Rod Volume 2, and he talks about how we have omitted many details. So the question is, okay, where are those details? I just wanted to point out that one quick thing. Then you can scroll down. All right, and I'll just read a couple highlights from here. This is from the pre-11th hour extra, first edition. So this is the first edition of Tract 1. He says, this article could have been greatly enlarged, and for brevity, all has been omitted, but that which will serve to introduce the message that is pleading at the doors of God's dear church. May the Lord have mercy on us all. Now, I want you to notice something here. Hodef, or I'll put it like this, Ellen White points out, even in regards to the Bible, she actually specifically says that it is not the words of the Bible that are inspired, but it's the people who wrote the Bible that were inspired. Interesting statement. There's a lot to learn from that. A whole lot to learn from that. She says that the writers of the Bible were not God's pen, they were His penmen. There's a difference. So what that lets us know is that these prophets receive light. Ellen White received a lot of light, some of which she never wrote. Amazing, hey? Especially seeing how much she wrote. Hodef received much light, some of which he never wrote. Part of the reason why we know that is because there were writings that he was in the process of putting together when he died. There was Answer Book 6 and 7, which he was putting into getting it ready for print. And even in the Answer Book 5, which he published during his lifetime, he actually said, he put a little note at the end to look forward to Answer Book 6 and 7. There was Tract 16, never published. Entering Wedge Part 2, never published. You know, these are things where he had received light, but he never got a chance to include it within his published writings while he was alive. And this is a natural thing, where prophets will be given light, and there simply won't be the opportunity to convey that all through the medium of writing. Today, it's a little bit easier that we have recording and, you know, all these other things, and more of the message can be preserved. But you see that the parts which are most important, he wrote down. And so his task was completed, you know. But there was more there. And this next statement as well is from Tract 6, Why Perish, page 31. Could you read that?
A world of butter-producing milk. These noble creatures give such a volume of milk that we are compelled to separate the cream and are able to dispense only it. The milk we preserve. This plenitude bespeaks our being blessed with such a fullness of truth, milk, that all we can do is to send out the high points, the butter or cream. Revealed truth, never before having amassed itself into such an inexhaustible store as it has today, completes the evidence that the interpretation of this prophecy is correct, and that the shepherd's rod, which contains the truth for this time, has caused the land to flow with milk and honey.
So you notice how they were just bringing out the high points. Those who lived at Mount Carmel Center with Hodef doubtless got a broader and fuller understanding of the truth for that time. And some of this we can even understand by looking at the letter-sized timely greetings. You know, the timely greetings that Hodef published in these little booklets, that wasn't, you know, the first form of it. It started with, you know, he preached sermons, there was shorthand notes taken, and then he would sit down and he would turn it into the full-size sermon. And then he would just print it out on just regular print paper, like this size, and hand it out to those at Mount Carmel. And then later, fairly soon after, they would take that and they would revise it to send it out in booklet form for those in the field, for Davidians and Adventists. And because it was to a broader audience, they left out certain sections. And when you look at these timely greetings, you can see, in addition to listing what songs they sang at the meeting and what, who played what instrument and who did the prayer and all that, there were also some things that were discussed and were part of their meetings that never made it into the publication that went out. And in those things, there's light. We looked at one example last Tabernacles, where Hodov explained that there's a distinction in the Scriptures between the two olive trees of Zechariah 4 and the two branches, and that the two branches represent Christ and His Spirit. That was only in the letter-size timely greeting. That was something which only those at Mount Carmel received. That never made it into the publications that went out to the field. It's just an example of, hey, he was a human being, and he was inspired with messages of truth. And he understood however many things, only a certain amount of which made it into his writings. But does that mean that just because he never got a chance to write it down, that we were never to understand it, that we kind of lost our opportunity to get a glimpse of the truths which were revealed to his mind? No, because inspiration continues, and those things were revealed to him for a reason. And those things are things that we are to understand. And Zechariah 4 is the perfect example, because further light has been given on it. And now we can see that the two branches are Christ and the Holy Spirit.
Do you know the timely greeting offhand?
I believe it is Timely Greetings, Volume 1, number 14. So, and it's the letter size edition of that. So it is, these are things that should just, make us realize, okay, you know what? There may be more there, even things that were potentially revealed to Victor Hodov that we never got an opportunity to understand, but that we should understand. Okay, so that's all just to say that there's more truth there than is what's contained in the Rod literature. Now, the particular references that are under consideration in this section of things are in relation to Ezekiel 4 and the 430 years. Now, the whole last section of this article is devoted to the 430 years. So we won't spend a lot of time on it right now, though tomorrow we will. But we do want to read a couple statements here to just, the purpose of this is to say, okay, for the Davidian mind who is saying, hey, wait, no, 1930, that's the end of the 430 years, that's when the seventh truth, by implication of Ezekiel, came. Therefore, there cannot be any more truth. So, having Ezekiel 4 as an evidence of the Rod message being the last, we want to look at a couple brief statements from Hodov that might give us at least a glimmering of being open to something beyond that when it comes to Ezekiel 4 and the 430 years. So if you want to scroll down to the quote, and this is taken from Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2, page 275. Yes, Winston?
I see this, if we look at it carefully, this is like a relay race. And a relay race is what, how many? 4 in a lane. Mm-hmm. And you have you have one, and the fourth will finish the lane, will finish the mark. Okay. And that is, now we are sitting in the second angel, not complete. Second angel is not, message is not complete.
Mm. The second angel's message is not complete, right?
So we're going forward now to the third.
Right.
And then from the third, there's a fourth.
Right.
And that's the finishing line.
Yeah, there is a progression of 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Now in the scriptures, an interesting thing that an Adventist may object to is the fact that Ellen White never uses the term fourth angel. Interesting, because we always talk about the fourth angel. She uses terms like the other angel, but she also says the angels to follow. And if I remember correctly, Hodov never even uses the term fourth angel. He says other angel and additional message, and there are the key terms that he used. But James White used an interesting term. He talked about the 5 angels' messages of Revelation 14. And he was looking at the messages of the first 3 with addition of the message of verse 15 and verse 18. But he didn't really include, you want the reference for that? Sure, that's in Word to the Little Flock. Is that page 9? Let me just double check on that. Okay, so it's a Word to the Little Flock. And it's actually page 11. And this is what he says. He says, all classes of Second Advent believers agree that the angel brought to view in the 6th and 7th verses of this chapter represents the Advent message to the church and to the world. If this is true, then all 5 of the angels brought to view in this chapter represent 5 distinct messages prior to the Advent, or we are left without a rule to interpret this chapter. Now, the reason why he said 5, most likely, is that the angel of verse 17, because there are actually 6 angels brought to view in the chapter, it does not record what that angel says or does, other than coming out of the temple with a sickle. But it doesn't quote the angel. So he just looked at it as 5 angels without including that one. But in reality, when you count, okay, another angel, the third angel, another angel, another angel, another angel. There's 6 figures which are specifically identified as angels in Revelation 14. There is another, though, because, again, why would there only be 6? There is another which occurs in verses 14 and 16 of that chapter, which is referred to as the one like unto the Son of Man, which is a clear reference to Christ, who is called the angel of the Lord. So, that is also a representation, and we'll go through this later in the week, of another message, right? So there are 7 messages in Revelation 14. And if we're going to interpret the first 3 to be messages prior to the Advent, then the rest must be as well. So here's the thing. Adventists just say 3 angels' messages. Davidians just say 4 angels' messages. Branch He believers, those who believe in Ben Roden's message and stop there, say, there's only 5 angels' messages. But what is the truth? In the Revelation, don't we have 7 candlesticks, 7 eyes, 7 stars, right? 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 thunders, 7 vials, 7 plagues, 7 thunders, 7 horns. We could go on and on. 7 beasts throughout the history of the world contained in Daniel and Revelation. These things come in 7s. There's a pattern being established. Are we really going to say there's only 3 angels, or only 4, or only 5? When we can actually identify the 7 angels' messages in Revelation 14. So that's just to keep in mind for as we continue on in these studies. So back to the statement, Shepherd's Rod, Volume 2, page 275. This is just to give a little preview into our study tomorrow on the 430 years. And this is just to let us know that there may be something beyond the application of the 430 years from 1500 to 1930 as Victor Hoddeth gave. All right.
You will also note on page 222 that the 430 prophetic years originally applied to Abraham and his seed overlap the 430 of Ezekiel 4. The 430 years of Ezekiel should terminate in 1929 or 1930, but the perfect fulfillment of the prophetic period of Abraham in its antitype is yet in the future, going out of Egypt. The chart on page 112 and 113 shows its termination in 1930. For, as we stated before, it is outlined by the coincidences which perfectly fit the prophecy of Ezekiel. As it is impossible to make a time chart without any date to go by, we have used these coincidences, and it is stated that the date is indefinite. See chart on page 133. Ezekiel's prophecy is intended to point forward to the announcement of the predicted Reformation and the one through Abraham to its completion, Ezekiel 9.
All right, so from that, let's just say we have a Davidian, right, who is saying, all right, the rod message came at the end of the 430 years, therefore it must be the seventh truth implied by the 6 grains of Ezekiel 4. Well, the rod message itself teaches that the perfect fulfillment of those 430 years is yet future. So if that's the case, and this seventh truth was supposed to come at the end of the 430 years, then wouldn't it apply at that time? Or at least, is there not room for a double application of that with another message? And also, he stated that the date that was used is indefinite. So like I said, we're going to look at this a lot more tomorrow and find the perfect application of Ezekiel's prophecy in chapter 4. But this should let us know that there at least cannot be, at bare minimum, an argument from the 430 years as laid out in Shepherd's Rod Volume 1 to say that there's no more truth. Because you can see how shaky that is when the perfect fulfillment of that prophecy is yet future. You can read the next statement as well. And this is taken from Shepherd's Rod Volume 1, page 155. And this refers to some of the things to take place at the end of the 430 years, which at the time was understood to take place anywhere from 1929 to 1931, but which we just read the perfect fulfillment of which was yet future. So go ahead.
Isaiah 62:2, a new name, indicative of the new experience they have passed through, which is the separation or sifting, as explained. God himself, with his own mouth, gives the name so it cannot be counterfeited. The time the name is received is at the end of the 430-year period, as explained on the chart on pages 112 to 113. Thus, the church is reorganized under a new name. The old name, being polluted, could no longer be retained. There is no one to go by the old name, for the ones who were not worthy of having the new name have perished under the figure of the 5 men with the slaughter weapons of Ezekiel 9. The name only remains for a curse. In Isaiah 65:15 we read, "And ye shall leave your name for a curse unto my chosen, for the Lord God shall slay thee and call his servants by another name." The old order of things being changed, the watchmen who were unfaithful have perished.
So notice that he says that there's a new name to be received at the end of the 430 years. And at that time, the slaughter would have taken place. And he referred to this chart. And when we look at this tomorrow, we'll look at the chart. And he had the end of that 430 years in 1931. So he was expecting, at least as a possibility, that the judgment for the living would commence in somewhere between 1929 and 1931. And that not only would the investigative stage happen, but it would also be executed upon the church. Now this, some people, in going back and reading Shepherd's Rod Volume 1, may just think, oh, whoa, he was prophesying that Ezekiel 9 would take place in 1931, and that the slaughter would happen, and all these things would happen. Therefore, Hadif cannot be a true prophet, because clearly it didn't happen. Well, he clearly stated in Shepherd's Rod Volume 1, while discussing these things, that the date is not definite, and he made no claim that it would happen. And he also, while publishing Shepherd's Rod Volume 1, was already trying to publish Shepherd's Rod Volume 2, showing that he already knew at that point, by the rejection of that message, that people would not be ready to undergo that experience. Therefore, everything that was stated indefinitely, and what was thought to have a possibility of taking place clearly did not take place at that time. So there was no new name given in 1930 or 1931. The slaying of the wicked in the church did not happen. But these are the things, Ezekiel 9 and the new name, are things that he was tying to the end of the 430 years. And why was that? So we're going to look at that tomorrow, because it'll all come together and make perfect sense. But notice that just as William Miller thought that, Christ was going to come in 1843, right? And then, no, that had to be corrected, Just so, Hodef, in announcing the soon coming investigative judgment upon the living, thought that perhaps this would take place in 1931. But that date had to be corrected too. But he, like William Miller, had an if there. He wasn't settled on it, He received a message, and it was in connection with a prophecy, and he was right in his interpretation that something was to take place at the end of that prophecy, though he himself did not fully understand what that would be. And I'll put it like this. With William Miller, he knew that at the end of those 2,300 days, the sanctuary would be cleansed. But he wasn't quite sure what that meant. And he, in fact, misunderstood what that meant. Hodef, he was saying that at the end of that 430 years, the new name would be revealed and the purification, Ezekiel 9, would take place, which he understood to have a slaughter right at the beginning of it, at that time. Well, later he understood that the investigative judgment for the living does not begin with a slaughter. It begins with an investigation that goes through a period of time, just like the investigative judgment for the dead. And so he also understood that this new name was to be revealed. Later, when this event did take place, it was a startling revelation as to what that new name was about. The only aspect of it that Hodef understood was the new name of the church. But the church gets its name from somewhere else. So that new name is not just the new name of the church. So these things we'll get into tomorrow, but we just wanted to kind of lay a little bit of a preview for that subject. And I think there's only one more section on this. Actually, there's a couple more sections to consider here, so we won't actually necessarily go through all this. The next section is the last message to the world. If you scroll down here, these references deal with the last message to the world, which clearly any Davidian in reading these statements will understand is yet future, because we're dealing with the message to the church primarily. So these bear no particular significance upon this study of whether or not the shepherd's rod message is the last, other than to say perhaps that the fact that the rod claims that the rod message is the last, and then there's also the last message to the church, or to the church and to the world, shows us that the fact that the rod message is the last does not mean that there's no more truth to come, period. Because he also said that there's last message to the world, which was clearly yet future. The next section is the last message before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, the time of the judgment of the living, the harvest, due to its being the latter rain. Now this should kind of catch us, because the rod message also had those statements saying it's the last message because it is the message of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. But here it says it's the last message due to its being just preceding the harvest, just preceding the great and dreadful day of the Lord, just preceding the judgment for the living. And in these statements, it includes statements of referring to it as being the latter rain message. So, since we've been going on for a while, perhaps should we just stop here and we'll pick up here tomorrow? I'm thinking that might be a good idea. And then it won't take too long to go through this, and then we can enter into the subject of the 430 years.